in the open and distance education. So yesterday we discussed about the learners assessment in distance education, the very first unit, because the assessment also forms part of the support system. So primarily the learner learns, studies for being evaluated and ultimately receiving a grade card or a degree, diploma or certificate. So if we take it in a serious manner, then we can say that assessment is very important part of the overall learning, because in assessment only culminates what the learner has learned, what the learner has received, and what the learner has progressed in whatsoever way. So assessment of learner performance is very important issue, and block 4 that the first part we discussed yesterday. We had the two units. Those were the learners assessment and distance education and tutor comments. So while discussing the learners assessment in distance education, we specifically focused our attention on types of assessments, like we have formative assessment and summative assessment. We also have the learners self-assessment, which is carried out by learner himself or herself. There is a self uh, exercise in the study material. So once you undertake that self-check questions, then you also go through the check your progress CYP. So if that is done, then that is part of the self-assessment. But as I mentioned just now, that we have two types of major or conventionally accepted evaluation, that is the formative assessment and the summative assessment. So the formative assessment is also called the continuous assessment, because this type of assessment is carried on while the program or the course is in progress. So it continues during the pursuit of the course. So that is why it is called the continuous assessment, and it is also a very important tool for monitoring of the learner's progress. So the formative assessment is known as continuous assessment and also monitoring assessment. Then we have term examination, which is part of the summative assessment. At the same time, there has been discussion on certain other evaluative methods. We all know that there are seminars, there are presentations, there are logbooks, there are field visits, there are oral examination, viva voce, so forth. So there are several other alternative assessment methods which are applied as and when required and as and when the situation demands. At the same time, we also have like online examination, on-demand examination, and so forth. So this part was related to the assessment of distance education, assessment of learners in distance education. Second part is the awarding of the marks and grade. So as I mentioned yesterday, that there are certain methodologies which are applied. So IGNOU adopts 5-point scale. So that means the learner's performance is rated between 1 and 5, 0 and 5. So as we saw yesterday, if the assessment is 1 or below 1, it is unsatisfactory and it is declared to be equivalent to fail in the conventional manner. But here the term is used, not successful. And then if you progress above, then the assessment and the marking continues to be higher. So along with 5-point scale, we also have the letter grade. That is, the lowest grade is E, and then we have D, then we have C, then we have B, and then we have A. So there is a numerical scale which is given. So if you refer to the graph that is given in your study material, I think it will be more clear to you. You can visit your study material and see how it is designed. Then reliability and validity of the assessment. So if you see the question of reliability and validity, in fact, it is very, very important because once the learner is assessed and certified or awarded grades and marks, then one should be able to perform up to those standards. So for that, there are certain parameters, there are certain criteria that the learners have to fulfill, and all these criteria are determined by either University Grants Commission, because those are in terms of performance and in terms of learning outcomes. So if you have seen the structured pattern of the study material, then there is a section which is learning outcomes. So these outcomes must be there after the pursuit of the course, and on the basis of those outcomes only the learner is graded or awarded the numbers. So the criteria is basically the level of question papers, the style of question papers, the methodology of question papers, the rationality of question papers. And at the same time, the validity is also very important because reliability is one thing, and the validation of the achievement is also very important. So the learners, as I mentioned just now, that the outcomes which are there already part of the study self-learning material. So those outcomes must be met, and the learners must go through proper the rigorous method of examination. And once the examination is taken and the scripts are evaluated, then all the evaluators are actually appointed by the university on the basis of their domain of knowledge and also their specialization, their experience in handling higher education for period as stipulated in the regulations. So, given this scenario, we can say that the question of reliability and validity is equally important because it should not happen. In many cases, it has been seen that the learners were just left to somebody who was just handling all the courses, all the areas, all the subjects, instead of being proficient in one particular branch of knowledge. So that issue should not be there, and the institutions must ensure that the study material or the methodology which is applied in providing distance education, in counseling methodology, in tutoring, in several other component of the academic aspect of the course or the program, they should be reliable. They should be built in such a way that they must train or they must orient or they must impart such type of education which is reliable. And similarly, then there are parameters which validates the standard, which validates the level of the education which is being provided. That was in Unit 1, which was Learners Assessment and Distance Education. We also discussed tutor comments. I mentioned yesterday and then in previous sessions also that this tutor comments is a very, very important topic, because we know that tutoring in distance education is very important. It is different from conventional classroom teaching. How it is different, what makes it different. Sorry, there was interruption in the signal and suddenly the screen was black. So I was discussing the tutor comments, which was the unit 2. As all of us know that distance education is definitely different from conventional education. So all we have to take care is that we must identify the distance tutor very, very carefully. We discussed the role of the classroom teacher vis-a-vis the role of the distance tutor, then significance of the type of interaction that takes place between the distance tutor and the student or the learner, which is very important. And we briefly, if I may say so, that there is three types of correspondence or three types of exchange of comments between a learner and the teacher takes place. So, first, it is of the academic nature. That is the main idea of the tutoring. Uh, if it is academic communication, that means it is with regard to the contents of the course or the material of the course, about the difficulty, about certain chapters, about certain ideas, about certain other knowledge pieces, information which is contained in the study material, level of the questions or the level of the material, or maybe the requirement of clarity at certain places. All this is exchanged through the academic communication. We also know there is a personal communication. So in personal communication, we understand that the learner is different in the distance education. She may have certain personal issues, personal matters, which which crossroads with the educational process, and also at the same time they might not be as sharp as others. So the grasping issue is there. A lot of issues are there. Any number of issues are there. So in order to handle all those issues, at many times the tutor has to make personal communication. Personal communication doesn't mean entering into the personal sphere of the learners. Personal communication means if one student is going through anxiety, depression, isolation, demotivation, or any similar kind of situation, in that case, the learner is supposed to make personal communication, and the expected result is that the learner should be brought out from all these situations. Then there is supplemental communication. So supplemental communication is to supplement the teaching learning process, what the learner is learning, and how the learner can learn better. The learner is motivated, the learner is further guided, and all sorts of issues are there in the supplemental communication. Supplemental communication is not restricted to the purely to the academic matters or to the administrative matter or to the personal matters, but it is also focusing on extended or extensions of the study, extensions of handling the situations, maybe it is personal situation, so forth. Then there are types of tutor comments. We discussed yesterday there are 5-6 types of comments. Firstly, there are harmful comments. So within the harmful comments, we came to know like null comments, hollow comments, horrible comments, and so forth. So we also have the positive comments. Those are constructive comments. Then we also have comments which are supplemental comments, which, as I discussed just now, So those are the type of comments which help the learner. These are constructive comments, positive comments, and so forth. But there are misleading comments, null comments, harmful, hollow, and negative comments. Then I also mentioned that there are two types of comments. One are marginal comments, another one is global comments. I very categorically mentioned about these two types of comments because many times we know that the learners provided the comments on the margin of the answer sheet or answer script. So those are marginal comments, but we must know why there are marginal comments, why there are global comments. Marginal comments are meant to pinpoint the deficiency or to provide the appreciation to the learner, to mention the adequacy or to mention any positive achievement with regard to a specific or a particular question. There are marginal comments which are made in the margin. But there are global comments which are, as I mentioned, that is summing up the entire uh, attempt. That means it can be either in the beginning of the in the script where the marks are awarded, or it can be at the last page of the script where a detailed description is given in the pointed form. So 3 to 5 uh, statements good marking of the global, I mean, good marking as global comments on the performance of the learner. So as I mentioned that there are three types of comments. First is harmful comments. So the harmful comments has the hollow, misleading, null, negative. Then we have the positive comments which relies on making constructive comments to the learner. And then we have personal comments which deals with the instruction, which deals with the suggestions to learner to come out of the depression or the isolation or sort of dealing with the withdrawals syndromes of the learner. So their teachers can play a very important role in bringing the learner out of such situations. So that was a recapitulatory session that we had yesterday. Today, I will continue with the unit 3, which is tutoring through correspondence. So this is quite important, tutoring through correspondence. Let me just tell you that here correspondence does not mean correspondence courses. Correspondence here is a means of transacting information. How do we share the information? So that information is shared uh, through the correspondence. It means it is an exchange of information, exchange of letters, and exchange of communication, which contains description of or which contains the assessment of the attempt that is submitted by the learner. It can be in shape of comments or any other way. The learner is intimated as to whether his or her performance is satisfactory or whether they are making good progress or they are not able to understand and so forth. So all these comments which we discussed in the unit 2, those are harmful comments, then positive comments, and then personal comments. All these are, you know,
Good
conveyed.
morning, sir.
Good morning, Aarti. How are you?
Sir, am I audible? Good morning, sir.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very, very good audio.
Yes, sir.
Uh, So, Aarti, we just had a small recapitulation of the two units that we discussed yesterday. Those were the learners assessment in distance education and the tutoring, uh,
Okay, sir.
and the tutor comments. So today we will discuss tutoring in the through distance correspondence, and also the supplemental interaction, because these are two types of exchange of information modes that takes place in the distance education. So
Okay.
yeah, so we discussed yesterday very explicitly that a distance teacher, which is called which we call tutor or counselor, is certainly different from the one which we call teacher in the conventional mode. Why I am using the word teacher and the tutor? That is for a very specific reason, because we know that a teacher is expected to lecture, to address the class in a classroom situation, and he is he is trained and oriented to teach the entire syllabus, uh, stage by stage, chapter by chapter, and also take care of students' issues on a daily basis. Uh, that way, the teacher might be facing sometimes a tough situation, but most of the time, his job is quite easy, his task is quite simple and easy. But when a teacher from the conventional education comes to distance teaching, his job or his assignment becomes more complex, more challenging, more demanding. How? That we will discuss. How? The answer lies in the characteristics of distance education itself. Distance education, as we know, it is an education where learner and the teacher are separated. The very first characteristic of the distance education. Secondly, it is very flexible a type of education. That means a learner in the conventional education, a teacher is not bothered about the presence. He can mark absent, and then the student has to, care for that. He has to manage how does one manage to submit the examination form and so forth. But here the situation is different. The entire system is student centric. Thereby, it becomes more challenging because the, he cannot handle the learner in the similar manner as was in the conventional education. So here, learner is autonomous. The learning is very flexible. It is transacted in a different manner. The learner is not coming to the classroom, so there is no question of regular face-to-face interaction. So now there is a problem. How to pass on instruction to such learner? How to deal with the problems of such learner? And how to handle such learner. So I am discussing these things because there is a very typical word used in the study material, which is the word is biases. Biases. The word otherwise on the face value in this particular study material is can also communicate negativity, but it is a fact that the, the conventional mode teacher, when come to distance education, he or she, because all of them have undergone the same type of education, which is conventional education, when they see that here the learner is free, learner is more relaxed, learning is more learner centric, learning is flexible, it is autonomous, and so forth, then one becomes biased. So the very first thing that when you bring a teacher from the conventional setup to the distance education, it should be the endeavor of the institute or the authorities to make sure that the teacher is totally trained for the distance education, thereby not holding any biases for the distance education. So this is a biggest challenge. We talk about the biggest challenge. Why it is a challenge? Because the teacher has to teach once one has taken up the assignment of distance education teaching, then he/she has to perform as counselor or teacher. We have noted that there could be any number of queries, any type of queries to the counselor. Those may be academic, may be administrative, may be personal, may be any of any nature. So his role becomes very, very difficult. So how to teach in these circumstances? So there are a lot of problems, there are a lot of challenges which a distance teacher has to face in distance teaching. So here the word fallacies and biases, it makes sense why it is mentioned here, because the distance learner is expecting too much from the system and the teacher. But at the same time, it is not possible to provide entirety in entirety whatever is demanded by the learner. So the teacher has to act in such a intelligent manner that he/she is able to entertain the issues raised by the learners, but at the same time, he or she must address them in such a way that they are addressed, one, for the satisfaction of the learner, and secondly, they do not make any false promise to the learner. So that means while they have to be very empathetic, very considerate, very responsive, very patient, at the same time, the distance educator is also required to be very straightforward, very clear, very, I should say, direct in communicating to the learner as to what his or her roles are, what is the study status, what is the methodology, and what will be the challenges of distance learning. So these issues are there. Now comes the issue of, as we mentioned just now, teaching through correspondence. So teaching through correspondence means tutoring through correspondence means sending instructions, sending messages, sending feedback to the learner. How does that happen? Through correspondence. That means the learner submits the assignments, or the learner writes a letter, or the learner manages to write an email or WhatsApp message, or can use any other platform for simply to put across his or her issue, maybe a challenge, maybe a problem, maybe a small piece of information, something like that. So, but if the learner writes and there is no response from the tutor or the teacher, it is a one-way communication, and one-way communication will never work. So there has to be two-way communication. Two-way communication is possible only through correspondence. Correspondence, if you look at the word itself, that it means adan pradan. That means there is letters are coming, letters are going, answers, questions are being raised, questions are being answered. So this is something to say that it is the adan pradan of सूचना, जानकारी और ज्ञान. So this is two-way communication. How does two-way communication takes place? The biggest instrument of two-way communication in the distance education is primarily through the assignments. What the two-way communication does, that is another issue. Why do we need two-way communication? Well, if it is one-way communication, then we may know about the learner's problems, but we may never be able to address if there is no mechanism for two-way communication. Secondly, and very importantly, the distance learners have different characteristics. They are at a distance. They are isolated learners. They have issue of motivation. They are at their place and pace. There is no teacher to share the issues with the teacher. Then the distance learners are also, you know, in a situation where they don't know how to study from the study material that is supplied to them. Because initially, if you look at the structure of the units and the structure of the course or the program, it sounds quite complex. But once dive deep into it, you definitely get more transparency in your mind, and much more clarity emerges. But that happens only when there is a teacher, when there is a counselor, when there is a tutor. So the tutor's role is to address your study problem. Study, they will impart you a type of skills. Those will be helpful in studying your study material. So that means it is very important that there is a two-way communication, because not only that will keep the learners motivated, but it also help the learner to develop certain study skills, writing skills, critique, and lot many other skills which would be quite useful in the pursuance of the program. Uh, then comes the question of the summative comments, because the formative comments are there already, which we have said two-way communication. Finally, when the learner takes the terminal examinations and appear in the summative examination, then or she receive summative comments. What do we mean by summative comments? Summative comments are actually, meant to motivate the learner for the further study, and also to break the monotony, break the isolation, and at the same time, the summative comments also helpful in dealing with with the deficiency or the lacunas in the study material. So the summative comments are the comments which makes an overall impact, because these are very comprehensive comments, and that way the teacher, the tutor who makes these comments will sort of make an observation on the overall performance of the class or group or whatever it is. But the problem with these summative comments is that these comments are in type of global comments. These may not point out an individual's performance or achievement. It rather reflects upon the uh, collective attempt of the class or a group or a peer group, or maybe a body of learners who are attached to distance education. So it is very important that the correspondence or the exchange of ideas, exchange of information that takes place through the formative comments, that means the uh, continuous assessment comments, is much more useful in shaping, in formatting the learners for the future study. Uh, we have already discussed what is distance teaching. We all know that distance teaching is different. It is different from the conventional teaching. It has to be different. Reason being that it has different objective. It has different methodology. It has different assessment mechanism, and the learner is assessed through a different pedagogy to pedagogy for awarding the grades or the numerical marks or whatever it is. So we have to see that different distance education is organized differently. Uh, it is not a type of education which is in the four walls of the classroom, which is provided to a group of learners who are homogeneous in the characteristics and so forth. So the distance learners comes from very different perspectives. They may not be very good in certain areas, may be very good in certain other areas, may be very good in literature, in social sciences, but at the same time might not be responding satisfactorily to the science subjects like physics, mathematics, chemistry, or life sciences, or may have much more interest in these areas, but they were not able to find good attention in their early period. So now they are a lot more confused. A lot of considerations. In fact, the characteristics of the distance learner that we have been discussing all through put together, all of them are making a very challenging situation before the distance teacher. So this makes the teaching very difficult. Yet I think the challenge has to be met, and that means, in despite all these odds, the distance teacher must keep the learners motivated. They should break their isolation, and they should also help the learner to achieve his or her objectives through the study, which is provided by help of various other means. And all this happens how? Learner is not coming, that is true. How to provide the instruction? Learner is learning through very flexible schedule. How to make him disciplined? Learner is autonomous. He is not there to listen to you all the time. How to make him listen? All this happen. You have to reach the learner. You have to guide the learner. You have to modify the learner. You have to make him or her an active learner. How? Just through the correspondence. And this correspondence then becomes a kind of tutoring. So it is a tutoring. It doesn't remain correspondence anymore. It takes the shape of tutoring. That means you tutor, you further the process of teaching and learning through correspondence. That is what we mean by tutoring through correspondence. Uh, this is a very important point, which is the dichotomy of ideal response. You understand the word dichotomy. Dichotomy is a duvidha, where to go, this way or that way, to decide this or to decide that. So there is a dichotomy between yes and no, between this and that, and so forth. So in distance learning, there has been a very important dichotomy, that is the ideal response, assessor's ideal response. As to what should be termed as an ideal response by the assessor, that means the distance teacher or educator. What response should be declared as an ideal response? This is very typical. So there has been several studies, there has been several cases which found out that it is very difficult to set parameters. Or one learner, one comment, very well done, keep it up. Question number 9 could have been further improved. However, it is satisfactory. This can be a very prompting statement to one particular learner. But very well done can also be a very vague statement to other learners. Where one has done very well, why it is not pinpointed, and whether all the performance that has been presented for the evaluation is demanding or is deserving very well done. And just like that, there are several comments which might be ideal to one particular group of learners, but they might not be ideal comments to the other category of learners. So this has to be understood by the distance educator or the distance teacher, that the comments or the correspondence that he or she makes with the learners is specifically addressed to an individual learner. It should not make a holistic or collective statement whereby the learner gets confused. So if we talk about it is kind of I mentioned that a type of comment may be very prompting, very encouraging for one type of learners, but it may not be for others. So it is unconsciously and culturally inducing some biases. Unconsciously, I feel I am giving very good comment, writing very good comment, but sometimes it may not be sound. It may not be very appropriate to the cultural settings of the learner. If some learner is very sentimental, I cannot make very direct comments. That means I cannot always say things truthfully, straightforwardly to a learner. Then the teacher has to devise a mechanism as to how to convey those things to the learner. So that is how it is called UCIB. This is unconscious culturally induced biases. So this can perhaps this phenomena, that is how it is called a phenomena. Phenomena means there is no set practice, but it does happen. So this bias can be reduced to certain extent if a conscious comment is made and specifically addressed to an individual learner. So that means tutoring through correspondence is quite a challenging task, and it doesn't leave the tutor in peace until and unless the learner gets satisfied or responds positively. Uh, then there is another issue with regard to tutoring through comments. That is the use of communication skills. So, how do we use the communication skills? There are a lot of examples, a lot of case studies in this area, because it is a behavioral area of study. This conscious, culturally induced bias. It's a behavioral science subject. It is obvious that it is open to debate, and there will be divergent opinions. So, what we can do? We can do the uh, didactic communication. Didactic means the study related communication, directional communication can be improved much to be better if the comments are written skillfully, and the teacher of the in the distance education has refrained from making what we discussed yesterday, the harmful comments. So it can only be improved didactic communication only when there is the communication is free from such comments which makes the teaching learning difficult process, which do not encourage the learner to come forward and learn. So And finally, teaching through technological medium. I think this we all know that there are a lot of alternatives these days to teach and to learn. So the distance teacher also utilizes, or the tutor also utilizes various platforms, online chat. All of us are now computer savvy today, so we can have data of the learners from the institution, and the tutor can quite often write notes. The advantage of the technologies is very important. The reason being that then the teacher or the tutor is not forced to just go to his or her office and then write the comments from that place only, because if it is through the regular postal service, then one must see that the letters are prepared, those are put in envelopes, the addresses are pasted, then all those are you know sent through the post. But these days, the technological advancement has changed all the scenario. So there's online chat. So if I write a piece of communication to the learners, within 5 to 10 minutes, I receive feedback, I receive callback, I receive email, I receive a message on different platforms. That sounds quite useful, and this platform has been sort of revealing, result giving. It has added to the quality, to the speed, pace, and also uniformity of communication. Then we also have the email, as I mentioned, wiki is there, then discussion forums. These days this is quite prevalent. On the internet mediated platform, there are discussion forums, and the learners who are member of these forums can participate in interaction, live chat, live interaction, and so forth. So uh, you will say that why we are talking about in terms of distance education, we are discussing these mediums or the technological media. We are discussing it because we must acknowledge and know that these are not only for entertainment, for purposes other than the education. These are heavily meant for the educational purpose, and I must say that a lot of study, lot of instruction is being imparted through these platforms. So this is very important that we take note of the advantage of these mediums. Similarly, we have like video conferencing, whiteboard. We know that this is one such facility which can help us in immediately modifying the uh, contents of our correspondence, and at the same time mark the feedback uh, message that we receive from the learner. So this was all to discuss in the tutoring through correspondence. So it is not very complex, but it is very complex in a sense that as to what is two-way communication through distance teaching, and also what do we mean by the didactic communication, what is assessor's ideal response. We have to understand all these issues. These issues are minor but become very prominent. They can be stumble stone in the progress of the learner. So we have to see that all such resolutions are there in the correspondence. Correspondence, I already uh, told you that correspondence doesn't mean the correspondence courses. Correspondence means this is an exchange of, I'm not saying the word letters, exchange of information, exchange of uh, pieces of academic knowledge, information, clarity, and the resolutions. It's like that. So this is happening. So we must accept technology has intervened quite a lot